This is Maggie Vires, and this is my presentation on Chapter 19. So I want to first talk about the skin. The skin is the largest organ in the body, and it's what separates us from the external environment. So it's constantly exposed to things like air, water, surfaces, so it's always interacting with potential pathogens, and the integumentary system includes the skin itself along with hair, nails, sweat, and oil glands. So together, these help protect the deeper tissues and also help regulate temperature and secretion. So the skin surface area covers about 1.5 to 2 square meters, and it ranges in thickness depending on where it's at on the body. So it's thin on places like the eyelids, but it's thick on areas like the soles of the feet. So because the skin and the eyes are both exposed to the environment, they share similar defenses and challenges, and they're often placed together like in this presentation when studying microbial diseases. So there's different layers and structures of the skin. The epidermis forms the outer protective layer, and it covers the skin and is made up of several layers of epithelial cells. So the top layer is called the stratum corneum, and it's about 25 cells thick, and it's made up of dead cells filled with keratin, which is a strong water-resistant protein, and it gives the skin its durability. And then these cells are constantly being shed and replaced from below, which helps remove microbes and debris. And then below is the epidermis. Below the epidermis is just the dermis. So this is made of connective tissues that are rich in collagen fibers and blood vessels and nerves, and it also holds hair follicles and sebaceous glands. These produce oil, and the dermis supports the epidermis structurally and nutritionally, and it also plays a role in immune defense since it contains macrophages and mast cells that can respond to pathogens. So the skin, we know, is one of the body's most effective barriers against infection, and its keratinized surface prevents most microorganisms from penetrating deeper tissues. So as the dead cells go off every day, they take attached microbes with them, and this helps keeping the microbes low. And the skin also produces antimicrobial peptides. These are small molecules, and they target bacterial membranes. And then we have sebum and sweat. So sebum is the oily secretion from the glands, and it has a low pH and a high lipid content. So this makes it tough for pathogens to survive. And then sweat adds another layer of defense because it's both acidic and salty, and this also helps inhibit microbial growth. And then finally, we have lysozyme. This is an enzyme that's found in sweat, tears, saliva. This basically breaks down peptoglycan in bacterial cell walls and destroys bacteria. So the skin might look like a great surface for microbes to live on, but it's actually pretty hostile for most of them. And the skin is dry, it's salty, and it's often covered with antimicrobial oils, which makes it hard for bacteria to grow. But there are a few areas where microbes thrive, mainly in moist regions like the underarms, the groin, and inside hair follicles. And each person's skin environment is a little different, and things like moisture level, oil production, and hygiene can also shape where microbes live. So even though the surface of the skin is tough on microbes, some have adapted to survive in those small protected areas. So there have been studies that show that skin is has a lot more microbial diversity than thought before, because there are hundreds of microbial species that live across different areas of the body. So the 5 major taxa and that is broad groups of microbes. So these are found in different proportions depending on the region of the body. So for instance, we have oily areas and dry areas, and they have different microbial communities. And even though the overall types of microbes may vary between people, each person's skin tends to maintain a fairly stable microbiota over time. And this basically means that there's a unique combination of microbes that's usually consistent unless something like an illness or an antibiotic or like a lifestyle change can disrupt it. So 2 of the most common skin microbes include Staphylococcus epidermis and Propionibacterium acnes. So these bacteria thrive because they can tolerate the skin's salty environment and low moisture. And even though they're normal parts of the skin microbiota, under certain conditions they can contribute to issues like acne or minor infections. And then around 4% of people carry Staphylococcus aureus on their skin, which is considered a potential pathogen. And normally it doesn't cause problems under the skin unless the skin is broken or the immune system is compromised. So researchers are still continuing to study how the balance of these microbes changes in people with skin disorders and what role they play in maintaining or disrupting health. So most microbes living on the skin are found on the outer layers of the epidermis and inside hair follicles, where they're more protected from the environment. And then about 25% of bacteria live in these follicles, so this makes them a stable part of the skin ecosystem. And what's really interesting is that some of these microbes might actually support skin health by competing with pathogens or influencing immune system response. So it's important to understand this because the relationship could help develop treatments that work with rather than against the body's natural microbes. So the skin, it doesn't rely on a single type of protection. It combines physical barriers and chemical defenses to keep pathogens out. So the keratinized surface forms a tough outer layer that microbes can't easily penetrate. But then we also have sebum from oil glands and sweat, like we talked about before. These help maintain an acidic environment and discourages bacterial growth. So every day, dead cells will go off and from the surface and take microorganisms with them, like we discussed before, and the skin's own resident microbiota will add another layer of defense by competing with harmful microbes for space and nutrients. And then all this plays a role together by creating a surface that's constantly resisting colonization by pathogens. So the skin can be thought of it as its own ecosystem with a constantly changing balance of microbes depending on the conditions of the skin. So areas with more moisture or oil, like the face or armpits, these support different microbes than drier regions, like the forearms. So many of these microorganisms form mutualistic relationships with our skin cells, meaning both sides benefit. And microbes get a stable environment and nutrients, while the host gains added protection from the pathogen. And the key to healthy skin lies between maintaining the balance of these microbes and the body's natural defenses. And when the balance is disrupted, skin irritation or infection can occur. So basically, the epidermis gives the skin its physical protection through keratinized cells that are replaced continuously, and beneath that, the dermis gives structural support, immune support through connective tissue, blood vessels, immune cells like macrophages and mast cells, and the skin's chemical defenses like sebum, salt, and antimicrobial peptides. These make the surface hostile to invaders, while lysosomes will break down cell walls in bacteria. So now we're talking about the range of infections that can affect the skin. So the skin surface, even though it's a tough barrier, it's often the first target for microbes. There are bacterial pathogens like Staphylococcus aureus and Streptococcus pyogenes, and these tend to cause abscesses or pus-filled lesions. And viral agents like varicella zoster virus or the rubella virus and measles, these can cause rash diseases that are often diagnosed based on their clinical appearance. And then we have fungal infections. So these usually remain on the outer layers of the skin and are spread through direct contact or can also be spread through indirect contact. And some of these infections remain localized, while others, like measles and chickenpox, they start in the respiratory tract and then produce skin manifestations later on. So I'm going to talk about the different types of infections. So we have, I'm going to skip to here. So impetigo. Impetigo is a superficial skin infection that affects mostly young children, and it's caused by Staphylococcus aureus or Streptococcus pyogenes, and both bacteria can coexist in the same lesion. So you'll notice like honey-colored crust. These develop as blisters and burst and dry, and they usually appear around the nose or mouth, where children frequently will touch and spread bacteria. And then this infection is interesting because of the mechanism of damage. So the Staphylococcus aureus produces exfoliative toxins that separate the skin's layers, and then Streptococcus pyogenes trigger immune-mediated inflammation. And treatment involves antibiotics and maintaining good hygiene to stop the spread. But reinfection is common if contaminated items like towels aren't cleaned properly. So now I'm going to talk about cellulitis. This is a serious infection that spreads below the surface of the skin, involving the dermis and the subcutaneous tissue, and it's primarily by Staphylococcus aureus or Streptococcus pyogenes, and it presents with redness, heat, swelling, and pain in the area. And this infection lies deep, so it can spread rapidly through lymphatic vessels or into the bloodstream, leading to a systemic infection. And this is usually common in people with diabetes or circulatory problems or immune suppression. So treatment usually requires antibiotics, or even if it's like a severe case, maybe IV therapy. And it's important to catch this early on to prevent complications like necrotizing fasciitis. I'm going to skip to that. Okay, so now we're talking about the eye and its anatomy. So this is basically focused on the conjunctiva and the cornea. These are two areas that are exposed to the environment directly. So the conjunctiva acts like a flexible protective covering that lines the eyelids, and it wraps around most of the eye. And it constantly secretes oil and mucus, which keeps the surface moist and helps defend against irritation and infection. And then the cornea, on the other hand, this is the clear window of the eye that covers the iris. So it's made up of 5 to 6 layers of epithelial cells. And one important feature is how quickly it can regenerate after minor damage. So this allows it to stay transparent and functional despite constant exposure to dust and air and microbes. So together, the conjunctiva and cornea make up the physical barrier that protects the inner eye structures from pathogens and maintains clarity for vision. So now I'm going to talk about the tear film. This is one of the most important natural defenses of the eye, and it's made up of 3 layers. So the aqueous layer, the oil layer, and the mucus layer. So the lacrimal gland, located at the outer upper corner of the eye, this produces most of the tears, and they drain through the lacrimal duct at the inner corner. So we're going to talk about the aqueous layer. This layer is full of substances that fight microbes like lysozyme, which breaks down the bacterial cell walls like we talked about, and lactoferrin. This binds to iron and limits microbial growth. And then we have the mucus layer. This helps trap debris and pathogens. And then the oil layer keeps the tears from evaporating too quickly. And I think this is also called the lipid layer sometimes. So the constant movement of tears across the eye surfaces flushes away potential pathogens. So the eye is special because it's considered an immune-privileged site. This means immune systems are less reactive than others. And this is a simple process because inflammation causes swelling and fluid buildup, which would scatter light and blur the vision. So the eye has evolved to minimize this kind of response. And in the anterior chamber, this is located in the front part of the eye, where there's limited blood flow. So immune cells like lymphocytes, they have restricted access. And even when they do get in, they tend to be less active than normal. So it helps keep the vision clear, but it also makes the eye more vulnerable to infection. So now I'm going to talk about the natural defenses of the eye. We talked about the tears and the tear film. The tear film constantly cleans the surface and contains antimicrobial substances like lysozyme and lactoferrin that help kill and inhibit bacteria. And every time we blink, we spread this protective film and physically move potential irritants out of the eye. And then the conjunctiva also contributes by secreting mucus, oils, and keeping the surface of the eye smooth and resistant to microbial attachment. And then because the eye lacks keratinized layer that skin has, it has to depend on these chemical defenses instead. So blinking, tears, mucus, these all form a powerful non-inflammatory barrier that prevents infection and keeps the cornea clear. So the eye microbiome actually contains a range of bacterial species, though much smaller ones than the skin or the gut. And the most common one is the Corynebacterium, and this appears to play a role in maintaining healthy balance on the surface of the eye. And it's small, but it's important in the microbial community because it helps protect against pathogens by competing for nutrients in space. And it's very similar to the skin microbiome, but adapted to the moist, exposed environment of the eye. So conjunctivitis, this is a disease in the eye. This is one of the most common eye infections, and it's basically inflammation that's clear the membrane and that lines your eyelids and covers part of your eyeball. So depending on what causes it, whether bacteria or virus or allergies, the presentation can look a little different. And bacterial infections tend to make the eye produce a thicky discharge, while infections usually cause a clear, watery exudate. And when it's due to an allergy, you'll see a lot of clear fluid but not much irritation. And patients often wake up with their eye glued shut because of the dry